Hello, Tim Wilmot here, and welcome to my watercolor tutorial. This time I'm going to cover how to paint reflections in water with watercolor. Now, just before I go on through this video, it's free to watch, not free to produce. If you do like these videos, please consider supporting me via Patreon at www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. Every month or two, I set painting projects for my members, and for a very small pledge, I'll give you a personal critique back to you with some extra hints and tips. So for more details, please go to my Patreon site, and you'll find the links in the description of this video below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you want to get automatic notification of new videos up and coming. So this scene is Livorno in Italy. It's an area of Livorno, the older part of Livorno, called New Venice, in that there's lots of these lovely canals, very reminiscent of Venice, and lots of small craft, lovely buildings, and of course reflections. So this is one of my own photographs, caught my attention. I thought it would make a nice subject for a watercolor, and to focus on reflections and trying to think about what color are these reflections, what are the values of reflections, what's the shape of those reflections, and the length. So there's really sort of four things to think about, and it all becomes easier with observation, really. I mean, there's some geometry to the lengths of reflections, but they're almost these reflections almost a mirror image. If we're looking at this scene almost at water level, it's almost a mirror image of what we're seeing, the reflection of a mirror image of what we see above. So a number of variables, a number of factors to think about when considering your composition. And as regards these reflections, apart from the length, we need to look at the shape of the reflections. So particularly with these boats, in that the reflections start off with a very sharp edge, and then they get more ragged as they come towards us, a bit more erratic. And the color of the color and the value of these reflections as well. Generally, they are these lighter objects. The reflections are going to be a level or two darker. So if we look at this boat here, for example, that hopefully you can see it's just a little bit darker than the object it's reflecting. Likewise with this wall, look at the value of that wall, a little bit darker. The value of the wall of the building, again a little bit darker. The value of the sky, a little bit darker. So those are things to think about in getting the values right and the colors right. So next, composition. I took this photograph from a bridge. I'm going to be ignoring a lot of the detail on the left hand side. These bamboo, this sort of split bamboo, I think it's like a lantern or something like that, and this electric lantern here, ignore that also. So let's see how we get on. So the paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford. It's 300 grams in weight, and it's cold press as regards the surface texture. So that's sort of medium in the middle, not too rough, not too smooth. And first step with me, as always, getting right the initial outline sketch. So here I'm using a soft pencil, fairly thick, just looking at the main shapes in front of me, and I've started with the tops of these buildings, going along the skyline and constantly looking at my reference photo. If I was painting outdoors, I'd be constantly looking at the scene, maybe almost half the time looking at the scene and half the time doing the actual drawing. So I've obviously thought about the composition as well, ignoring a lot of the left-hand side of the picture. The dimensions of my paper are a little bit different from the actual photograph. The photograph is like a wide screen dimension, so I guess it's 16 by 9, whereas my picture is more 4 by 3, so I'm a little bit more squat, so I can ignore those wrapped up umbrellas on the left hand side. My focus is using this as an exercise to go through these reflections, how to paint these reflections in water, and concentrating on the different colors and the values and so on. So now I'm just getting in the row of boats, and again a little bit of an exercise in perspective, with the distant boats being a little bit smaller than the nearby boats. And right over to the right hand edge, we've got a little bit of that boat showing there. That's one decision that has to be had, is objects that you see part on the picture, part off the picture. If it was a boat or a car or a building, do you include it, do you exclude it? Well, I've made the decision just to include part of that. But I just thought about these shapes. I'm not necessarily thinking about drawing individual boats. I'm just thinking of the jagged nature of the tops of the boats and the waterline of those boats, and likewise on the left hand side, just a few marks to give the impression of the outline of those plants and things in the planters on the left hand side. Now, with the shapes of the reflections, I'm just getting in a rough sort of outline of the reflections, starting with the top of the building and then the top of the wall there. Just a sort of indicative line for me to follow, which I'll try and stay true to. But I might deviate slightly from that when I come on to the actual painting itself. Likewise with the boats, just a few random squiggles. Of course, near the waterline, they're quite sharp, straight, but as they come away from that waterline, they get a little bit more ragged. Lots of windows on this building. I'll just give the impression of a few of them, just to act as a guide. A few nice verticals to those windows. And then that line in the water. Probably don't spend more than more than about 5 minutes or so doing the outline sketch. Not too much detail, but thinking about the perspective and any focal points, just trying to make sure I get those in. And also in my mind, I'm thinking about, from a value point of view, where is the lightest part of my painting, where's the darkest part of the painting. So light areas are on the left, or that wall that the sun is sort of it's over to the right somewhere and it's coming down to the left hand side. So trying to think about the light areas and the darkest areas of the painting as well. Probably here it's going to be along that on the right hand side, in and amongst the boats on that waterline. So the initial outline drawing has been done, and step number 2 is to now lay down the first wash. So if I could just describe my palette to you and the colours that I've got in my palette. From the top I've got neutral tint, at the very top there on the right hand side, neutral tint, then burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, then I've got a few blues, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, and then a bright red, which is Windsor red. A lot of these paints are from Winsor and Newton, but a few other manufacturers are represented here. For example, the neutral tint I'm using at the moment is from Daniel Smith. I find that mixes quite well with other colours and nice sort of granulation to it as well. So going down more on the right hand side, we've got a light red, then a cadmium orange, and then a cadmium yellow. So this second step then is laying down the wash and just thinking about the areas that we're going to leave white. Of course, in watercolor, the lighter areas, those that are going to be very bright or white, they're going to be left unpainted, particularly large areas as well, and that's why we've done the outline drawing in many cases, just to try and get right in our own mind the areas of the paint that we're going to paint around. Now I've started with the sky, just put in a broad area of yellow ochre there. I'm using a mop brush for this, which is a Raphael mop brush. Now I'm using a bit of cerulean blue there, just fairly loosely putting in the sky. Trying to do this as quickly as possible. The board's got a slight slope on it, so the blue is now sinking down into the yellow ochre. Now over to the building and trying to introduce a few different colours and values into that building, so that it's not too sort of flat and all one value, a bit more interesting to look at. Now, quite warm, a nice red over on that wall on the left hand side. As I say, it's going to be one of the darker areas of the painting. Now the left hand side is going to be done quite loosely with this big brush to give the impression, well, we don't want too much detail over there. Hopefully the viewer's eyes should be immediately seeing this row of boats and maybe going along this row of boats to the background, but we don't want to really over clutter the left hand side. So I'm just really thinking about the main areas of lights and darks, and with this big brush just putting in some bold marks to give the impression of something going on there on the left hand side, some vertical, horizontal marks. There were these benches and tables, so if you started with those benches, if you started drawing every single leg and slat on the table, it would be just too much. We're trying to paint in a loose style here, just give the impression of something over there on the left. So now for the harbour wall. And paint around the tops of the little boats. This brush has got a very good edge to it. It's a synthetic brush, not a natural hair, but it sort of works. It sort of has the same quality as a natural brush as regards how soft it is, and the handling of the brush as well. So and a very good edge, which was necessary for going around the tops of those boats. Now we're coming down into the water now, and this is the first time where I'm having to think about the value of the reflection of that far wall. So you can see I've gone a value or two, a level or two darker, and a darker red as well. Not worrying too much about the end of the reflection. That's going to be merged into the sea. And then this is going to be the base colour now of the boats. The thing to also remember with watercolour is that the paints are going to dry a lot lighter. So when you're mixing your colours, you've got to compensate for that and go a little bit darker than you think, because it is all going to dry a little bit too light. I personally don't like very light watercolors. I like the impact of dark values against light values. So sometimes when you paint in that way and you put down the paint on the paper, you think, oh gosh, it's going to be too dark, like this sky here. Well, it is going to dry a lot lighter. So going over to the that darker colour below the boats, and this final bit in the bottom right corner, we'll be going over that again. So I'm just really painting down a base coat here, just an initial coat for this, which I will go over with some of the more details, the reflections, as a later stage. Now we don't need to worry too much about these colours bleeding into each other. It's quite nice sometimes getting those soft edges, but with this particular building, we can go in with a few dark lines afterwards to add a bit more definition to the different areas of those reflections. So it doesn't really matter that things are bleeding in with each other. And it might look, at this stage, it might look like a total mess. To be honest with you, I think I'd agree with you if you thought it looked like a total mess, but hopefully as you go through, things get pulled back. I very often find with my watercolors that after that first wash, I look at it, I think to myself, this is a mess, and how can I make a picture from here? But you just persevere, and with practice, you just know things get better after looking maybe slightly worse. So don't give up as such. Now, timing is important with what I'm doing here, in that I'm trying to add in the impression of some soft waves, not too many. I have to be careful not to overdo it, but that the reflection of the sky was still a little bit damp. So it dried a little bit. It's gone past the sort of moist stage. It had lost, if you looked at that paper against a light, it had lost the sort of glistening or shining against a light. So it was damp, and I've gone in with a thicker colour just to get those soft edges. So a little bit of wetting wet, if you like. So I've now got to let all of this dry before going on to the next stage. So after doing the initial wash, the next step for me is to go in with some darker values, and starting with the background. Now I'm using a smaller mop brush now. This is a Jackson's mop brush that, well, it's lost its point a long time ago, but I'm still using it. And sometimes these brushes that are a little bit old and they've lost their edge or they've lost their point, they can sometimes give some nice shapes when you're painting in a loose way, particularly useful with foliage or backgrounds, anything where you don't need to be too precise with the control. So quite a light background, a sort of bluey green, if I could describe it as that, with those trees in the background. And that immediately adds a bit of definition to that left-hand wall, getting that dark value above it. Now I need to go excuse me, I need to go a bit darker in value with the building, the wall of the building, and that wall in the middle. And then down to the harbour wall, that needs to be darker still again. So with the same brush, not too much water on this brush this time, which enables me to get a bit of a nicer edge to it. But like I did with the wash of this wall, first of all, I've got lots of different colours in there, and with these different brush marks I'm making, it's a little bit, we get little patches of light, patches where it's a bit darker. And then as I'm coming down to the wall, I want to, there was some, you could just see the tops of cars, maybe tops of some people and other street furniture as well. So I'm just giving the impression of that. Not a straight edge, when I'm coming down to the top of the harbour wall. So just check the edge of my brush, and then that middle wall, and maybe it might just bleed a little bit into the background. It doesn't really matter. If it does, it does. Just let it do it. Don't unnecessarily interfere. And I've gone up to the side of the building as well, and just use the finger just to help things along, to smudge and just encourage these two areas to mingle with each other. There's a bit of a shadow on the left-hand side of that wall, and a line, not a continuous line. Do you see I've done a little bit of a lost and found there with that line, just a few gaps. Perhaps it gives the impression of just some of that line there just deteriorating or disintegrating. Now back into this main building, and want to go a little bit darker at the top, so you can see it's all still quite damp, so we're getting these soft edges appearing. These different sort of wetting wet techniques I handled a couple of videos ago. If you'd have seen my little watercolour tutorial of Staithes in North Yorkshire in the UK, where I handled quite a few different techniques and examples of wetting wet. So, and it's a very, in a way, it's quite a similar scene. Now this harbour wall, darker in value than the wall of the building. Try and get a nice deep red. Red's the prevailing colour. A lot of the harbour walls around this New Venice area of Livorno. At the top of the wall, likewise, when I came down with the buildings, it wasn't a straight edge. I've just introduced a few little bumps and troughs and so on. It's not a complete straight wall. And now there's not very much water on this brush. It's almost a dry brush strokes, picked up a bit of neutral tint at the top, quick way of going really dark for some impact on the value scale. And the way I'm dragging those brushes is sort of in line with the angle of the harbour wall. So we're now coming down to the tops of the boat, so immediately they're beginning to look a little bit more like boats, hopefully. And while that harbour wall is still wet or damp, with slightly thicker paint, I've gone in and added a few downward strokes there, just to imply some of the supports of that wall. And just to mess things up a little bit, a tiny bit of splattering, which again, you have to time that right with the splattering. If you leave it too late and what you're splattering onto has long since dried, nothing will happen. You'll just get these wet blobs that will gradually dry up and come to nothing. And do it too early, then it almost disappears, because there is this sort of right window of time to do splattering. So I've decided now to do the reflections of the building. So I've still got that gap of the reflection of the harbour wall. And notice how much darker I've gone, and going over to the reflection of the sky with those wave marks, which is quite easy to do if you've got the appropriate brush for this, a good brush for this, which I find generally will be a mop style brush, something that's got a bit of flexibility in it, and does allow you to, at the edges of these margins, get the wave-like shapes to it. Now, while that's all drying, I'm just going to paint in a few of the planters on the left-hand side that are just overhanging. There's a little sort of cafe. I seem to remember, I didn't actually visit it myself, but I seem to remember it's quite a nice looking cafe overlooking. It's like a sort of jetty on the water's edge, and you had some steps going down to it. And these nice planters on the left-hand side. Maybe in a way they're sort of balancing the row of boats on the right and sort of leading us into the composition. Of course, these plants are growing in a planter, so there's my terracotta planter. Tables behind, just basically some geometric lines. Different horizontals. Might come back to that in a minute, that area. So I'm trying to speed up the drying process now with the help of a small hairdryer, and you might detect that when it dries it does go just a little bit lighter, and the paper surface as well, it tends to buckle a little bit. I'm often asked, do you pre-wet the paper? Well, no, I don't. I don't stretch the paper. It's just laid down, and I use this masking tape to secure it on my board. And yeah, it does buckle a little bit, but I don't mind that really. It particularly with those waves, that can help with when the paper buckles a little bit, helps you getting that wave shape when you're drawing, painting in those waves horizontally. Now just a few shadows to these plants on the left. I'm not sure whether they were lavender or rosemary or something, but not too much. You can see the paint is resisting a little bit. Got to have a bit more water in that brush for the splattering to take effect. Right, just check how dry that building is up above. Now there are lots of windows on this building, and I'm just going to paint in the impression of a few of them. And you can see it's just well, with the same brush and with as good an edge as I can. I'm getting in. I can still see the pencil lines below, so that's a good sort of guide for me. And just the impression of a few windows, and thinking about perspective again. Those windows a little bit larger as they come towards us. Now these boats we'll need to think about the colour of these boats. They're not white, quite obviously. They're in the shade, and so I need to lose their white colour, except maybe for just a few little spots along the top of the boats, along the top of the hull. And then the reflections of those boats. So going back to what I said earlier, this is a little bit darker than the actual colour of the boat. It doesn't matter if there's a little bit of bleeding going on. The reflections get a bit bigger, bit larger, coming towards us. And a bit of splattering to finish with. Now I need to dry this again, make sure this is 100% dry before going in with the next stage, which of course we've got this gap now, the reflection of the harbour wall. Pretty obvious that's going to be the next thing to do, or one of the next things to do. So ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna there. Sometimes I almost spend as much time mixing as actually painting. It's all about getting the consistency right and making sure everything is thoroughly mixed. I do sometimes find if I'm working particularly quickly, you could almost mix the colours on the paper. Watercolour paper is quite tough and it can take a fair bit of rough treatment. So you can see how much darker now. Well, it is going to dry a little bit lighter, of course, but quite light. It's going to dry quite lighter. But now we've got in a bit of the reflection of that middle wall. And again, with as good an edge as I can get with this brush at a slight angle, drawing in a few of those darker reflective marks, which hopefully is now starting to look a little bit more realistic. So coming over to the right, this is now the reflection of the harbour wall, and starting with where the boat reflections finish, down to where the reflections start for the building, getting in this quite dark band in that middle there. Trying to be careful not to go over too much of the shadows of the boats. They've got to be a little bit larger in size as they come towards us, and then keep mixing this darker value, just fill in that gap there. Keep mixing. Same sort of thickness, really. Not too. It's not too dry, not too watery. We're coming up into. Come up into the building, the wall of that building. I'm just thinking about these erratic waves. And once I've done that, I've painted that area, I want to try and resist the temptation to not overwork it. And now just thinking about the edge of these, the edge I've created there. And now the very edge of this reflection of the top of the building. Perhaps a reflection of a few windows, not too many. Just a few there. Of course, you have to sort of look at the building above just to make sure that they are, if you imagine a vertical line down from the windows to reflection, they sort of join up. Something that makes a boat instantly look like a boat is getting in that water line, which is what I'm doing now. So a darker value, do you see, to the water line, it hopefully it just suddenly shouts boat to you. It just looks a little bit more convincing. Doesn't need to be a perfect line. In fact, the more ragged the better. You know, this little bit of rippling of the waves there. It's not totally, the water's not totally still. So we're almost getting to the detail stage of the painting now. We finished painting the bigger areas of the painting. Now concentrating on little bits and pieces. What I'm doing here is using almost a dry brush to add in a bit more definition to the harbour wall, just some of those angular lines coming down to indicate maybe some sort of either supports there. Give it a bit more interest. So with the same mop brush, I think that left hand side needs a few darks in there. Maybe some windows on that. Very, it's quite a bright building on the left hand side. And I thought when I put in the shadows on the those planters, I thought it was going a little bit too dark, but you can see how light those initial shadows went. And that far, like the boats need their water line, that far building likewise, get that in there. And even though it's a line separating those two shapes, it sort of connects it, makes it look as one, and just helps with that impression of these reflections. And of course the shadow of that building needs its reflection, darker still as well. In fact, if it was very dark, then the reflections would be a little bit lighter, of course. nothing beats actually just observing a scene. If you're out there doing some plein air painting at a scene like this, or looking at a photograph, just spending maybe 5-10 minutes looking at all the different values of the objects above the water and the objects being reflected in the water, the actual reflections in the water, just taking time to look at those values and get the plan right in your own mind. Now with a small brush here, I'm adding in a line across the top of these holes. Again, this is generally makes boats look a little bit more interesting when you get this line across them, and there's not very much water in this brush. It's almost a dry brush stroke again. Then thinking about maybe a little bit of the reflection of those lines also. So a bit more drying here, speeding things up. So I think the building needs just a few more darks underneath the eaves of the roof. A few verticals. It's always good to have a few verticals in a picture. Could be lampposts. I think these are drain pipes here. And then add in a few more darks into the windows. Just a few marks against the harbour wall. And top of the harbour wall. Perhaps make this shape into some sort of a car. It's sometimes fun just picking up some area that you left unpainted, like that little white area there. I can straight away make a little figure out of that. So a face appears, and then putting a body below it, putting a torso below it, and those little gaps can sometimes be made into something. So really quite dark here now with this brush. I said earlier I wasn't going to do the slats, those tables, but I ended up doing them. Might wish I hadn't done that later on, but we'll see. So we really are going through the final stages of this painting, and of course a big issue with painting, especially with watercolor, is knowing when to stop, and you get the law of decreasing returns as you get towards that that imaginary point of when is the optimum time to stop painting. You can overdo things. It begins to look overworked. You lose that freshness of a watercolor, and it just comes with practice, really. So a bit of final drawing here. Up the top as well. Back to a small brush, small round brush. This is a little, I think it's an Escoda brush, this one, but it's got quite a good point on it, and a nice edge as well. So just with some of these nearby windows, just give the impression of some shutters there. Makes it look a little bit more Mediterranean, Italian, whatever. And we're done. So here's my end painting, and together with the reference photo, a scene of Livorno in Italy. And what this tutorial is all about is a sort of a fairly simple exercise in reflections in water and some simple boat shapes as well. Thinking about the length of these reflections, the shape of the reflections as well, which only comes through a bit of practice and observation, and then colours and values. Also an exercise in composition, thinking about what to leave out. I decided that some of these little details, like this lamp here and this bamboo lantern here, leave those out, and these ones that are sticking out as well. It didn't do too much for the composition, but I kept in the shapes of these parasols, maybe some shadow underneath these blinds here coming out, so I've tried to give an indication of those. But I want the focal point to be on this row of boats here, and leading the eye. Maybe the eye initially glances here and it sort of goes up the row to the back, and maybe that background building, or maybe it hits there first and it comes down these boats. So a little exercise in reflections. Thanks very much for watching, and catch up with you next time. Thanks very much indeed.